children of an unknown world, driven by unquenchable hunger. Who knows how many planets, empires, or even entire galaxies they have turned into building material for their untold hordes. They have no need for power, money, or influence, for they cannot quench their indomitable thirst for devouring. These creatures need flesh, whether it is alive or dead, whether it is loyal to the Emperor or has sold out to the gods of chaos, for to the great devourer it is just fuel, and he will get that fuel at any cost, even if it means a galactic massacre. So sometimes even exterminators is a mercy compared to the coming of the enemy called Tyrannids. Evidence of the Tyrannids' presence in the galaxy appeared sometime before the first attack on an Imperial planet. But the Imperium, immersed in its own problems, paid absolutely no attention to the harbingers of the coming threat. The first of these was the spread of mysterious genestealer cults in the eastern regions, overthrowing rulers loyal to terror and plunging the population of the planets into the heresy of worshipping abominable idols. The second was an insignificant, relative to the entire size of the galaxy, spot in warp that resembled a shadow. It was slowly growing, hiding system after system, but no one cared about its existence at that moment. After all this was happening at the very edge of the galaxy, far from the most important and valuable worlds. For a long time, the problem of this anomaly, growing in the galactic east like a drop of ink soaking a sheet of paper, remained unnoticed. But the situation could not remain like this indefinitely. Panic reports and the disappearance of signals from the planets reached a critical mass, which drew the attention of Imperial officials who sent the young Inquisitor Fidus Cryptman to the region. He didn't know at the time that he would find his life's work in this very assignment, so he set about gathering information about the Tyrannids. This xenorace gets its name in honor of the Tyrant Prime outpost, the destruction of which is the first documented case of hostile Xenos ravaging the Imperial world. It happened around the year 745 of the 42nd millennium. It cannot be said that this attack came as a complete surprise to the defenders of the outpost. Not long before that, researchers from Tyrant Prime had begun to record an increasing number of strange worlds in nearby space. Whereas previously they had been teeming with life, recent studies had found that not even bacteria could be detected on their surface. The planets were turning into bare rock, devoid of even the minerals previously contained in its interior. Such findings did not bother scientists and administrator members alike too much, because there was no known intelligent life on these worlds. By attacking only such planets, the Tyrannids were counting on a similar effect. Exhausted by the long flight between galaxies, they needed to replenish their forces. So at the very beginning of the invasion, they attacked worlds that were not expected to offer much resistance. And so the devoured prey turned into ranks of warriors with shiny chitinous shells and sharp claws. After gaining strength, the Hive Fleet decided to switch to the fattest prey and directed its hordes towards the Tyrant Prime outpost. The fact that the Imperial world had a chance to prepare for the impending invasion turned out to be pure chance. A returning research vessel serendipitously stumbled upon a vast cluster of unidentified entities on the fringes of the Tyrannid system. On closer inspection, these objects turned out to be biological mines. The ship had to break through them, but at the cost of heavy damage, the ship's crew managed to overcome the barrier and deliver a dire warning to Tyrant Prime. In a couple of days, the mysterious enemy arrived at the orbit of the world, and the invasion began. The Tyrant Prime outpost, commanded by Varnak Magos of Adeptus Mechanicus, was no easy target. The world's main base was nestled among an ancient chain of volcanic islands. It was prepared to withstand both Chaos warbands and units of the Xenos, known enemies of the Imperium. On this world were the Astra Militarum forces, several squadrons of fighters and 4 huge orbital lasers set deep within the ceramite mines. These huge structures were not only protected by hollow shields, but were further fortified by a network of artillery firing points and Proteus-class bunkers. Now, these centuries-old defences had to withstand the onslaught of a new, hitherto unknown enemy. The first to engage were the defence lasers, which opened fire on the ships that had arrived in orbit. A real storm raged in the sky for more than an hour. The artillerymen of the base were desperately trying to destroy the enemy, even at the distant approaches to the planet. The fire was so intense that the cooling systems of the units began to glow white and overheat. They were about to fail. But fortunately for the defenders, the enemy also stopped their attack, stopped by the fierce fire. Considering this a great success, Magos Varnak ordered his small fleet to pursue the retreating enemy in confusion to finish them off. However, this strategy proved to be flawed. Breaking through the cloud of spores, the ships found that no more than a dozen of the several thousand bioships had been destroyed. It also came to them that by this maneuver, the enemy had trapped them. Having lured the Imperial fleet out from under the protection of the planetary defense guns, the Hive fleet began attacking the doomed ships with redoubled force. Despite the heroic resistance of the crews, their ships were either destroyed by volleys of biocannons or cleansed of life by boarding. Very quickly, the fleet of defenders was finished. And then a new, much more massive attack began. Thousands of Tyrannocytes rained down on the surface of the world. Although the air defense systems destroyed many of them, more reached their target. Most of the spores fell into the planet's vast ocean, so its waters were literally boiling with monsters bursting out of their organic shells, breaking through the sea to the main defense node. At first, disciplined volleys and a well-organized fire system succeeded in driving the enemy away from the walls of the fortress. The spaces between the bastions became veritable killing fields, where several waves of Hormagaunts and Genestealers, who were the most numerous ground combat forms, and were essentially expendable for the hive mind, rested against the Imperial orders. The fighters also took an active part in the defense, destroying the spores before they could release their horrible contents. But, unfortunately, this could not last forever. Thousands of gargoyles, flying forms of tyrannids, attacked the northern laser and littered the massive beam projectors with their bodies, thus putting it out of commission. This caused a huge hole in the wall of deadly fire created by the Imperials. It was immediately taken advantage of by the hive mind, which instantly increased the pressure on that particular area. A huge Carnifex, a massive, heavily armored creature designed to deliver powerful blows, literally rammed through the fortified wall, and thousands of smaller forms immediately poured into the breach. Things were no better in the air either. One by one, the fighters fell to the ground as either their engines choked on spores or their cockpits were torn apart by screeching harpies, another flying tyrannid's fighting form. And some of the Imperial combat vehicles simply fell to the ground, having used up all their fuel supply. Toward the end, they simply couldn't land to refuel on the airstrips the enemy had captured. Slowly but surely, the collapse of the base's defenses began to set in. All lasers were already silenced. The most advantageous positions had been abandoned due to the impossibility of defending them. Even the guards from Catachan, whose bravery had never been in doubt, were shaking and fleeing in panic. All of them hoped for salvation, which, in this situation, was simply not possible. Only in some places there were some pockets of resistance, the defense in which held only on the fortitude of some of the officers who kept their personnel from panic. But even these levers were soon suppressed. The finale of the whole tragedy played out in the command bunker. Even the hive mind had found a means to overcome its sturdy walls, and soon they began to crack under the heavy blows. Finally, the adamantium gates were the first to fall, and a flood of tyrannids poured into the bunker. They literally swarmed the command complex, even as the remnants of the Skitarii and guardsmen fought them with flamers and phosphex. Realizing that there was no hope left, Magos Varnak described all the events that had transpired and his thoughts on the enemy. He uploaded this data into the data codex in the hope that it would survive the disaster and be found by someone with sufficient competence to appreciate the vital value of this information to the Imperium. This is exactly what the Inquisitor Cryptman turned out to be. It was after this discovery that he decided to devote his life to fighting this terrible enemy of mankind. If not for the arrival of Fidus to the dead planet, the fate of Tyrant Prime would have been covered in mystery for many years. Cryptman arrived on the devastated world a year after its destruction. In place of the planet's vast oceans, he found a bare rock. Having familiarized himself with the data, He was able to assess the threat looming over the Imperium, so he urgently rushed to warn humanity of the danger, which he named Tyrannids, in honor of the first world destroyed by these new enemies. The Tyrannic Wars began. The Inquisitor ordered his astropath to send a message warning of the impending threat, but it was unable to get through the disturbance in the Empyreans caused by the Xenos recently in the system. This made it impossible to communicate even with the nearest telepathic amplifier complex on Tandros system. Realizing that there was no need to delay, Kryptman set a course for that system. There he hoped to restore communication with the rest of the Imperium. As it turned out, the route to Tandros coincided with the path of the enemy's advance deep into the galaxy. This allowed the Inquisitor to discover several more dead worlds and realize the power of the new enemy of humans. On the way to his goal, Fidus Kryptman began researching the problem, gathering all sorts of reports on the planets under attack, as well as events that had occurred in the region over the past decades. Trying to understand the reasons for the lack of communication, he was the first to describe in detail the phenomenon called shadow in the warp. He was also the first to describe the sequence of Tyrannids invading planets. Thanks to the data he collected on the planets he had already destroyed, he calculated the route of the Hive fleet. The enemy moved in a completely ingenious manner, moving from one inhabited planet to another and devouring everything in its path. The Inquisitor concluded that the Tyrannids were driven forward by hunger, which they could not satisfy, no matter how much biomass they consumed. On top of that, as custom demanded, Kryptman labeled the new threat with a name taken from ancient myths, calling the Hive fleet Behemoth. Though the Inquisitor drove his ship forward, stopping only to gather the most necessary data, he was still unable to outrun the Tyrannids and arrived on Tandros after it had been destroyed. The planet, which had neither strong defenses nor a large garrison, simply didn't stand a chance. This was a big blow to Kryptman because the situation was becoming critical. According to the Inquisitor's calculations, Ultramar was next on Behemoth's path. The Ultramarines' domain was the last frontier to stop the oncoming hordes of enemies. Fidus realized that if he failed to do so, the Tyrannids would break through to the heart of the Imperium. In addition, they would gain untold amounts of biomass. After all, this part of the human state was one of the most populous and prosperous. It was necessary to warn the Astartes of the legendary order at all costs. So Kryptman took a risky and unorthodox step. Instead of racing against the Hive fleet that had gotten far ahead, mercilessly burning out the plasma engines, the Inquisitor decided to try to restore the amplifier complex. If successful, he would give the Ultramarines much more time. After all, thought is swifter than any ship. But if unsuccessful, the arrival of the enemy would come as a complete surprise to the sons of Guilliman. And yet the Inquisitor and his companions had succeeded in setting up the complex with a great deal of hard work. This was immediately followed by the exploits of the Psyker, whom Kryptman had instructed to deliver the fateful message. He realized that the minutes of his life would be numbered as soon as he connected to the complex. For the transmission of even one small message through the shadow in the warp would require all his vitality. And so it was. Literally bleeding to death, he was able to send a single message, after which he died immediately. Since there was no way to communicate back, Fidus could only hope that the recipient had received an important message. But there was no time for doubts, so Kryptman moved towards Macragge, which was about to be hit by the enemy. Fortunately for the Ultramarines, and for all mankind, the addressee received the message, and that person was none other than the head of the Ultramarine Order and Lord of Ultramar, Marneus Calga. Taking the warning of the Inquisitor unknown to him before seriously, he gave the order to prepare for defense. The already powerful fortress, considered one of the most perfect in the galaxy, began to create new fortifications to organize a warm welcome to uninvited guests. New lines of defense were being built on the ground. Especially great attention was paid to the fortresses located at the poles of the planet. On these wonders of imperial fortification, Calga made the main stake in the ground part of the battle. The main power of air defense systems which were to cover the skies of Macragge, was also located there. On top of that, new orbital stations were constantly being launched into the planet's orbit. Macragge prepared to stand to the last man. The Master of the Ultramarines assigned an important role in the coming battle to the fleet. Marneus Calgar knew from Kripman's reports that the Tyrannids' fleet was extremely large, but lacked firepower. It was for this reason that he decided to try and reduce the difference in numbers as much as possible. Every spacecraft that was even remotely suitable for combat was requisitioned. In addition to the Titanic-sized ultramarine battle barges and heavy cruisers of the Ultramar's fleet, lightly armed merchant ships had gathered around the planet. Even privateers joined the fleet of defenders. Some of them fought for money, some for the Emperor, and some because their captains' bridges and engine rooms were under the control of Calgar's loyal Marines. And so, after weeks of preparation, the first enemies began to arrive in the system. Perhaps someone else might have been intimidated by the power assembled to defend Macragge. But not the Tyrannids. It didn't take them long to attack the defenders. The combined fleet was the first to meet the enemy. Bioships came in waves against the men's formation. All of them were met with a powerful and orderly fire, which inflicted heavy losses on the attackers. But time after time, the mass of the enemy pushed the defenders' fleets further and further back into their defenses. Eventually, the Tyrannids were able to drop mycelic spores on the planet. For a time, the Calgar forces successfully contained the incipient invasion of the planet's surface. Maneuvering and retreating intelligently, the Ultramarines tried to hold off the onslaught of the invading enemy. But even under the leadership of the legendary Lord Ultramar, could not stop the forces of the Hive. Systematically and without panic, the defenders retreated to the polar fortresses. A heavy loss for the defenses was the enemy's capture of the spaceport in Sirocco. The Genestealers who stormed the spaceport killed most of the spaceport workers and shuttle pilots, destroying much of the transportation as well. This was a severe blow to the logistics of Calgar's forces. The Thunderhawks he had left at his disposal were completely insufficient for this purpose. The situation was getting worse by the hour. Therefore, Calgar decided to hold a general battle at the Cold Steel Ridge. The enemy was also concentrating their efforts in this area. The Tyrannids, who had sufficiently studied the tactics of the Ultramarines, realized that Lord Macragge was the main link in coordinating the defense, and if he was destroyed, the resistance would be significantly weakened. To this end, the Hive Mind sent its deadliest weapon into battle, the Hive Tyrant, who would later be classified in Imperial reports as the Swarm Lord. How many battles this creature has fought outside our galaxy remains a mystery. But what is known is that it led the final assaults on Tyrant Prime and Tandros, honing its tactics for fighting humans. The new Tyrant entered the battle, and in an instant, the entire look of the swarm changed. The insatiable maddened spirit that had driven the Tyrannids into frontal assaults on the mountain ridge was gone as if it had never existed, leaving something more judicious in its place. It was then that the realization began to dawn on the Ultramarines' commander that the battle was lost. The Imperial forces, accustomed to frontal assaults, were facing a new enemy with a more cunning and flexible strategy. First, the Raveners sprang out of the frozen ground right in the middle of the left flank defenders. Creating a living wall of their snake-like bodies, these diggers cut off the auxiliary Marines from the main Calgar forces. While the second company of Ultramarines fought their way to the cut-off units, the Imperium soldiers there came under massive attack by the Tyrannids. After a while, the Space Marines who had broken through to their positions saw a horrible picture. The trenches were filled almost to the top with dead bodies of soldiers mixed with the carcasses of various monsters. Hormagaunts were already feasting there, having attacked the surrounded Marines while they were fighting the enemy in their positions. The Astartes destroyed the enemy with their bolter fire. As it turned out, this stratagem was itself a deceptive maneuver, forcing the Imperial forces to leave a huge breaking blade-type battle tank called the Pride of Hera uncovered. This mistake of the Ultramarines was taken advantage of by the Lord of the Swarm, directing a crowd of Carnifexes to tear apart this powerful fighting machine, hindering his further advance. Thus the enemy destroyed key Imperial positions on the left flank. Calgar, on the right flank, grimly watched the destruction of the Pride of Hera and the doomed remnants of the left flank. Witnessing this spectacle, he had to come to terms with the fact that the enemy was nothing like the foolish horde he had seen at first. The defences, which at first looked indestructible, began to crumble like a house of cards. There were no longer enough Astartes warriors darting between the ever faster and faster appearing breakout points. Responses to Calgar's tactical decisions were coming as fast as they were appearing. At this time, the Hive Tyrant decided to finish off his opponent, so, surrounded by guards, moved towards the positions where the Ultramarine Master was fighting. A battle immediately broke out between the two. A desperate move by the men to hold their existing positions was to summon Thunderhawk of Space Marines to the battlefield. But it quickly became clear that they would only be enough to support the evacuation of survivors from the battlefield. With a powerful blast of turbo lasers and heavy bolters, the pilots managed to make room for 3 warships to land. The enemy began to interfere with the evacuation in every possible way. Even the superiority of people in the air did not stop him. Calgar, which had been badly damaged in the battle with Lord Roy, was evacuated at the same time. This was done only at the cost of the life of Aloysius, the commander of the Honor Guard. And the result of the battle was that the commander of the human forces was seriously wounded and out of the battle for some time. The army of Ultramar actually ceased to exist, and now the polar fortresses were left to rely only on their own forces. If the battle on the ground could be said to have gone just out of hand, then in space the fleet was a complete failure. At the time of the arrival of the 9th wave of attackers was lost a number of large ships. A large part of the armed merchant fleet had also fallen into oblivion. Macragg's new Star-class orbital stations had been reduced to bleeding mass graves orbiting the planet. And at the end of the 12th wave, the planet's orbital defences effectively ceased to exist. At that point, only a handful of ships remained of the fleet. That's why the captains decided to save the available ships instead of throwing them into the already hopelessly lost battle. And so the planet was left without cover from space. From that point on, her defenders on the surface could only count on themselves. Now there was nothing to stop the Tyranids from expanding the size of the invasion. After all, the departure of the human ships allowed the Hive fleet to disperse its ships over the entire surface of the planet and bombard the polar fortresses with spores without any visible obstacles. This made the situation of their defenders even more difficult. However, the war in space did not end. Calgar, who was in orbit and had agreed to only minimal medical attention, took command of the rest of the fleet. He began attacking the ships of the Hive fleet, which by then had already dispersed, surrounding Macragge. At this time, the assault on the polar fortresses was in full swing. The hive mind feared that Calgar would interfere with it by trying to come to the aid of the besieged. Therefore, he decided to make a deceptive maneuver, starting to withdraw his bioships to the ring world Cretaceous on the edge of the Macragge system. The Master of the Order of Ultramarines took the bait and began to pursue the enemy fleet. When he caught up with it, another battle unfolded that became decisive in the defense of Macragge. Each side planned to ambush Cretaceous. Calgar received word from the Tempestus fleet that it would be arriving soon, and immediately began to work on a joint attack on the Hive fleet. At the same time, the Tyrannids planned to team up with their second fleet, which they had hidden there in advance. The first to strike was the Hive fleet, encircling their pursuers with the help of the second fleet. But no sooner had the opponents exchanged even one salvo than the Tempestus fleet appeared on the scene of the battle. Now Imperial ships began to crush the rear of the enemy, destroying entire clusters of ships with their crushing firepower. But even the sudden appearance of fresh Imperial forces could not fully compensate for the Tyranids, still outnumbered many times over. There is no telling what the outcome of the Battle of Cretaceous would have been had it not been for the feat of the crew of an Imperial-class battleship named Dominus Astra. She steered her wounded ship into the thick of the enemy fleet and detonated its warp engines. The resulting explosion and the resulting rift in space defeated most of the Hive fleet. The battle then entered its final stage, in which the remnants of the Tyrannid's fleet were scattered. Not a moment too soon, Calgar sent the combined fleet toward Macragge, hoping to reach the remnants of the forces defending the planet in time. The Master had no contact with the defenders, therefore he did not know the real state of affairs. At the same time, at the poles of the planet, the remnants of the forces of the defenders of Macragge were fighting desperate battles. It was there that the Astartes of the First Company, who gathered around them the remnants of the auxiliary forces of Ultramar, were trying to hold back the onslaught of the enemy. To the south, countless waves of Tyrannids had breached Davidan's perimeter and forced the defenders to retreat deep into the base under the protection of its mighty walls. But the huge and powerful Carnifexes breached them, continuing the Congeners' onslaught. Under the frenzied onslaught, the defenders of the South Polar Fortress eventually had to take refuge in the catacombs, where they continued to hold out, hoping for help. At the North Pole, the situation was much bleaker. The Lord of the Swarm was personally leading the assault on the fortress. His mere presence among the stormers had already terrified Macragge's warriors, not to mention the deadly actions. The defences had managed to hold for a while, thanks in large part to the command skills of Captain Invictus, commander of the 1st Ultramarine Company. But unfortunately, there was no frontier that could contain the Hive Tyrant. Therefore, the defenders were soon forced to retreat to their last positions, which were in the catacombs in the very centre of the fortress. The Ultramarines who arrived on the planet saw a depressing picture of a devastated planet. Mountains of Tyrannids' corpses lay everywhere, the largest of which were near the polar fortresses. Survivors were found only in the deep catacombs of the southern fortress, and to get to them, they had to spend 3 days fighting with the lictors who were in the corridors. In the north, no one survived. Invictus and the last men of the First Company were killed. Their bodies were found in the very centre of the fortress, where they stood shoulder to shoulder in a circular defence. In the same places, they surrounded themselves with mountains of enemy corpses and died. Thus ended the invasion of the Behemoth Hive fleet into the galaxy, and with it the First Tyrannic Wars. It resulted in the complete annihilation of this enemy of mankind. However, it left behind a trail of worlds turned to bare rock. It took many years to clean up and rebuild the surviving Macragge. It took no less time to rebuild the forces of the Order of Ultramarines. After all, the First Company was destroyed in its entirety, and the 3rd and 7th suffered extremely heavy losses. Although the humans were able to repel the attack of unknown until then, Xenos, but in a large list of enemies added a new name, Tyrannids. As further events showed, this name would remain there for a long time. After all, this attack was not the last. About 2 centuries have passed since the events of the Behemoth Hive fleet invasion. During that time, the Imperium has had little contact with the Tyrannids, although a few small Hive fleets have penetrated the galaxy. Other races took their blows. The most famous battle with the Tyrannids of all time was the battle off the world of Kelshan, where the Imperial fleet sent as reinforcements to the forces fighting in the company in the Damocles Gulf clashed with the forces of the Gorgon's Hive fleet. This led the warring Tau and humans to make a temporary truce and work together to destroy the common enemy. This and other hives were mistaken by most Imperial scientists for fragments of the Behemoth Hive fleet as well. Thus, these researchers tried to prove that the enemy was finished. But time has shown that these judgments were extremely far from the truth. Few people knew that at this very moment a new invasion was already gaining momentum. By the beginning of the 990th year of the 42nd millennium, Hive fleet had already penetrated the tentacles of the Kraken deep into the Milky Way. Apparently, this hive mind took into account the mistakes of its predecessor and invaded not as a single mass, but divided into several tentacles, which were groups of small fleets moving in the galaxy. He also had the foresight to increase the power of the shadow in the warp, to make communication between the worlds that were about to be attacked as difficult as possible. All of this had resulted in the loss of communication with an entire sector that had been isolated by the Hive mind shadow in a single moment, almost within a matter of standard hours. Only a handful of survivors were able to escape the invaded sector and tell the rest of humanity tales of skies blackened by poisonous spores and huge monsters roaming the devastated lands. Thus it became apparent that a new invasion had begun, and these events can be considered the beginning of the Second Tyrannic Wars. The first Kraken tentacle to receive an armed response was the fleet that arrived in the Miral system. There, regiments of Imperial Guard Space Marines from the Order of the Scythes of the Emperor held out heroically against the Tyrannids, who had already taken over part of their namesake world. The Imperial forces retreated to a huge rocky massif known as the Giant's Coffin. It became their main line of defense. This cult preached the imminent end of the world, and it did it so successfully that, according to some reports, up to 3/4 of the planet's population showed up at the place of Tyrannid's arrival to be swallowed up by the new living gods. And it wasn't the only one. Another battle of the Second War was the battle for the mining world of Devlin. Thanks to the heroism of a company of whalers and the powerful fire of the Nova Storm space station system, millions of civilians were evacuated on a large fleet of ore carriers. The world itself was lost, and the company of whalers defending it was destroyed in its entirety. If we look at the events that were happening on a galactic scale, the Kraken attacked with a front thousands of light years wide. Planets were often bypassed and isolated. New attacks or cultist uprisings occurred in unexpected places. All of this simply made it impossible to create an organized defense. The Imperial authorities made the difficult decision to concentrate their efforts on the most important factory worlds and hive worlds, while the secondary worlds were either evacuated or abandoned to their fate. In desperate battles with the advancing enemy, the Order of the Whalers suffered heavy losses, turning from an unstoppable force into shards of its former glory. The Emperor's Scythes suffered even more, having lost their homeworld of Sotha and losing almost all of their personnel in the battles for it. The Order of the Knights of Eternity was destroyed. It was not to say that there had been no attempts to attack the tentacles advancing deep into the Imperium. They were, but they were too chaotic and insignificant. Fortunately for humanity, the Kraken did not disperse its forces, but began to pull them towards the Imperium's most important world, Ikar IV. This hive world was vital to the functioning of the economy of the Imperium's eastern region. It was the very case that the Genestealers' cult's rebellion, meant to facilitate the Tyrannids' takeover of the planet, made it more difficult on the contrary. It brought the planet to the attention of Imperial command, and it helped determine the direction of the Tyrannids' next strike. And it all started with the fact that Ikar IV was greatly influenced by a religious fundamentalist group called the Brotherhood. Perhaps this fact would have gone unnoticed because it preached the cult of the Emperor, although it interpreted it in its own way. But its leaders refused to pay tithes to the governor and forbade its adherents to join the planetary defense forces. The sect's conflict with the administration caused unrest on the planet, resulting in riots. When Adeptus Arbitraris units were brought in to quell them, the riots turned into an armed rebellion. After brief fighting, the governor of the world was killed, the government was dispersed, and the rebels seized key points. Also, most of the units of the planetary defense forces came over to their side. The loyalists controlled only part of the countryside and the Adeptus Arbitra fortress. Inquisitor Agmar was the first to react to the news of the mutiny. He arrived to the Imperium on Ikar IV by the 27th day of the rebellion. It took Agmar a couple days to realize the nature of the rebellion. So he decided to enlist the help of the Space Marines. The Astartes arrived a few days later and immediately began to restore order on the planet. By active actions, they quickly took control of key points. Thus, quickly defeating the rebel defenses, the Space Marines reached the main temple of the Brotherhood. Having cleared the building itself, the Astartes began searching for underground passages, which were bound to be present if the suspicions of Inquisitor Agmar were correct. It didn't take long to find them. The entrance to the tunnel system was discovered under the altar. As soon as they managed to open it, a flood of genestealers came from inside. The hunch was confirmed. After a brief battle, the Astartes conducted a sweep of the catacombs, which ended with the destruction of the cult's patriarch. This success was deemed sufficient. Inquisitor Agmar then reported that the planet had been cleansed of the Xenos infestation and order had been restored. Having analyzed the available information about the movement of the Hive fleet forces and the fact that the Genestealers' cult had appeared on Ikar 44, the Imperial Command came to the conclusion that this planet would be next in line. As a result, the Ikar system was prepared for defense in advance. A thorough work on strengthening the defense systems was carried out. No resources were spared, and Marneus Calgar, master of the Ultramarine Order, who had perhaps the greatest experience in the fight against Tyrannids, was involved in organizing this process. But the Kraken was also gradually gaining strength, devouring one world after another on its way to the system. Thanks to this, it devoured billions of tons of biomass, which increased its fleet many times over. Imperial commanders realized that there was a heavy battle ahead, the outcome of which would determine the fate of the entire company of the Second Tyrannic Wars. This made everyone prepare for the battle with redoubled energy. The Kraken approached Ikarth IV in the year 992 of the 42nd millennium, and the first thing that marked its arrival was an uprising of genestealers that proved to be an unpleasant surprise to the world's defenders. Thousands of the insidious individuals burst from beneath the planet's surface and struck back hard. Inquisitor Agmar made a mistake, and that mistake cost many lives of the defenders of the planet. Panic reigned on the surface of the world, and the Tyrannids took advantage of it. This allowed them to break through the defenses and begin landing on Ikarth IV. In the blink of an eye, not only the familiar Gaunts and Carnifexes, but also the previously unseen Biotitans and Araphants appeared on the planet. The Hive swarm threw everything it had into the battle. However, thanks to the energetic actions of the command, the crisis of defense was quickly overcome. The thorough preparations for the invasion also made themselves felt. Calgar's defenses were built with the experience of the battle for Macragge in mind, and now they were destroying the Tyrannids with terrifying efficiency. The Ultramarines also developed a successful tactic that allowed them to repel the enemy's attack without any problems. In addition, the Astartes, veterans of the First Tyrannic Wars, made their contribution. This led to the fact that the enemy was quickly expelled from the planet's surface. There was also a battle between Marneus Calgar and the Swarm Lord, which this time ended in favor of the brave Imperial warrior. Without the Swarm Lord, the Tyrannids lost a clear chain of command, leading to their final defeat. The Battle of Ikarth IV was the first human victory of the Second War. The battle showed that with skillful command, a Hive fleet could be defeated without incalculable losses. But it was too early to celebrate victory. The Kraken had not yet been completely defeated. However, the humans were not the only ones who had to face the new Hive of the Great Devourer. In the path of the Kraken's second major tentacle was the elder craftworld Iyanden. The battle for it unfolded in 993 of the 42nd millennium and was one of the greatest tragedies for this large and densely populated artificial world. The first physical evidence of the Tyrannids' approach was reported by a Iyanden ranger who detected a fleet of enormous size moving towards the craft world. At this point, the Elder already knew that a planet-devouring enemy had appeared in the galaxy, but the inhabitants of Iyanden had not yet encountered it. Although the craft world could move, the Tyrannids' fleet was so huge and fast that it was impossible to hide from it or to create a front line to hold it back. Kelmon, the spiritual leader of Iyanden, announced that they would have to unite shoulder to shoulder if the Eldar were to see even a glimmer of hope. The entire artificial world began to strengthen, and each of its inhabitants began to prepare for war. For the sake of protecting the world, it was even decided to awaken the avatar of Cain. Despite the mobilization, the defenders of the craft world were greatly outnumbered by the oncoming swarm. So Kelmon took the desperate step of enlisting the help of ghostly warriors. thus allowing even the ancestors to be called into battle. Many Eldar perceived this as grave digging, but there was nowhere to go. So the soul stones were removed from their burial sites and placed in psychostone constructs to fight alongside their descendants. Not even 24 days had passed since alarming reports of the approaching Hive fleet began to arrive, and the first swarms of Tyranids had already begun to attack Iyanden. By this time, the shadow in the warp had already isolated the ship from the outside world. The Tyrannids, like swarms of predatory fish, attacked the huge behemoth of a ginormous world. Wave after wave of masses of hungry monsters rolled in, but each successive attack was different from the previous one. This prevented the Eldar from anticipating the direction and size of subsequent attacks. The Tyrannids used such tactics to wear down the enemy forces. Although the defenders of Iyanden had an impressive fleet, it could not influence the course of the battle to its full potential. The shipyards simply could not keep up with the flow of ships in need of repair and maintenance. This led to the fact that soon the forces of the defenders began to run out. Without giving the defenders the slightest respite, the Hive fleet continued its furious onslaught. Soon 2 huge attacking waves of warships and spores, exceeding the size of all the waves that were before, like the mouth of a giant monster, closed in on the ranks of the defenders and crushed their defenses. A flood of hideous creatures rushed to the surface of Iyanden. The battle raged throughout the craft world. There was not a hall or corridor that the invaders did not penetrate. Everywhere battles raged, moving from one to the next, sometimes resembling a sort of layer cake, in which one level or corridor belonged to the monsters, another to the Eldar, and the third, coming next, was again occupied by Tyranids. The war even went beyond the real world. Zoanthropes and Eldar sorcerers competed in fierce psionic duels. Time passed, the Eldar losses grew, but there was still no end in sight. It was a real battle of attrition, in which the already dying Elder people had no chance. Many of Iyanden's children had already accepted their bitter fate when Prince Iriel's fleet appeared near the artificial world. Despite his vow never to return to his homeworld, where he had been stripped of his title 10 years before, the rebel prince could not abandon his home in distress. Like Cain's fiery spear, Iriel's powers travelled through the orders of the Hive fleet, blocking the path to the artificial world. The prince was a talented naval commander. Teaming up with the remnants of the World Defenders fleet, he conducted a series of successful attacks on the largest bioships. In this way, he made sure that no more of the Kraken's vile spawn could reach the surface of the artificial world. The defenders of Iyanden, who were preparing to die, were unaware of the reinforcements arriving until they noticed that there were no new waves of invaders. It turned out that the Hive fleet had been defeated, but victory in the skies did not mean the end of the battle for the artificial world itself. And that's where the Hive tyrant entered the fray. He led a maddened mob of monsters that swept away everything in its path. Wherever the advancing monsters were stopped by the psychostructures, the Hive tyrant used his huge scythe. All attempts to stop the onslaught failed until Prince Iriel arrived on the craft world. Of all the people on the ship, he was the only one who could kill the huge monster. Taking in his hands the Spear of Twilight, which was so powerful that it gradually burned out the life force of its bearer, after a brief struggle, the prince used it to pierce the head of the mighty creature and bring it to the ground. With the loss of the hive mind's will guide, the remnants of the Tyranids' forces became a scattered pack that was quickly annihilated. The Eldar had won a heavy victory, costing them 4/5 of their entire population. The craft world, with its once magnificent towers of psychostructure, resplendent crystal domes and intricate architecture, lay in ruins. It was an irreparable loss to an endangered race, but it was still a victory, no less significant than on Ikarth IV. Without knowing it, the humans and the Eldar had become unwitting allies. Thanks to their actions, the Kraken Hive fleet had largely ceased to exist. Only fragments of it remained, now no longer posing much danger. Unlike the previous time, the interval between invasions was quite short. 4 years later, in 997, the first signs of invasion began to appear in the Ultima and Tempestus segments. They were first detected by Inquisitor Cryptman, as they had been 200 years earlier, and he immediately reported them to the High Lords of Terror. This time, however, he spotted a cluster of Tyrannids that had never been seen before. For its size, the Inquisitor gave the new Hive fleet the name Leviathan. Everyone realized that they were on the brink of the Third Tyrannic Wars. By the way, the new Eater took into account the experience of his predecessors and made significant changes to his tactics. Leviathan, like the Kraken, did not unite all his forces into a single strike fist. Instead, it began to penetrate the galaxy with individual tentacles. But whereas the invaders had previously penetrated the Imperium from its eastern edge, the Hive fleet came out of the plane of the galaxy and attacked the Milky Way from below, where it was least expected. Thanks to this trickery, the Tyrannids were even able to reach the solar segmentum. Unfortunately, by the time Inquisitor Cryptman was able to raise the alarm, the shadow in the warp had already separated dozens of worlds from the human state. And some of them had already been irretrievably lost, such as Valador and Saint Capilena. Relying on a tactic that had once worked to protect only militarily and economically important worlds, the Imperial forces, once again led by the Ultramarines, with the support of the Order of the Artifact, arrived in the Tarsis Ultra system. It was an important manufacturing world that became a model for other Imperial planets of this class. It produced a huge range of products in incredible volumes, making it extremely valuable economically. In the Tarsis Ultra system, in addition to the world of the same name, there were several other planets. The first of them, on the very edge of the system, was a planet called Barbarous First. The war had come to this God-Emperor-forgotten world. Barbarous First was a planet of miners, covered with a network of small settlements. In total, it was inhabited by about 9,000 people. The moment the Hive swarm arrived in the system, the fate of this world was sealed. Although the head of the local community had been given a warning of the impending threat, he was powerless to change anything. The only vessel capable of removing the inhabitants was several days away from the planet. The inhabitants of Barbarous First did not have that amount of time. All they could do was erect barricades in the settlements from improvised means. Armed with whatever was at hand, the settlers began to prepare for the inevitable. The fleet, under the command of Ultramarines Captain Uriel Ventris, still attempted to outrun the hungry hordes of Tyrannids. However, all the Imperial forces managed to do was arrive at the planet to witness the tragedy of an entire world's demise. The fate of the planet was decided in a matter of hours. Lacking strong defenses, it quickly fell to the onslaught of the enemy, and all of its biomass became the deserved spoils of the conquerors. The Emperor's angry warriors, who had witnessed such a horrific spectacle, decided to avenge the planet's destruction, and struck at the feasting enemies. The fleet assembled for the defense of the system went on the offensive against the Tyrannids, who were busy devouring the spoils. The strike that followed, though powerful, did not have the expected effect. The Hive fleet quickly reorganized their orders and began to offer organized resistance. The result of the battle was that the Imperium fleet suffered significant losses, but was unable to do any significant damage to the enemy. The first battle for the Tarsis Ultra system could be considered lost. After the first unsuccessful battle, it was decided to retreat to a planet called Cordelia. It was a manufacturing world with a population of 16 million people. Between Barbarous First and Cordelia, there were two more planets: Paros, an uninhabited world with a poisonous atmosphere, and Ulan, a volcanic world where hydrogen plasma was produced by special orbital factories. These stations, as improvised weapons, were relied upon by Admiral de Court. One of them was therefore evacuated to Cordelia. This planet the Admiral used as one of the arguments in the dispute that divided the command of the defensive operation into two camps. The first was led by Captain Uriel Ventris, who was supported by Admirals de Court and Tiberius. The second camp was formed around Inquisitor Cryptman. He was supported by the commanders of the Order of Astartes Mortifactors, led by Chaplain Astador. The dispute itself centered on the issue of evacuating civilians from Cordelia. Ventris favored continuing the evacuation to the last possible opportunity, even at the cost of major fleet losses. Kryptman, on the other hand, argued that the planet should be immediately subjected to exterminatus with all of its remaining population. In the Inquisitor's opinion, Captain Ultramarine's plan was putting the combined fleet at great risk, and on top of that, it deprived them of the opportunity to exterminatus the planet in time. This would give the Tyrannids an additional influx of biomass that could instead be destroyed. That's when Admiral Decourt intervened. Recalling the tragedy on Yulan, where during an evacuation attempt at one of the processing plants, it detonated, vaporizing the ships around it with its explosion, he proposed using the same plant as a timed explosive. The immense damage from such an explosion was expected to deter the Tyrannids from attacking the planet in the near future. This idea was agreed upon unanimously, and it was decided to proceed with the plan. At the appointed time, everything was executed according to Decourt's strategy. The station was aimed directly into the mass of Tyrannids advancing towards Cordelia, and as it approached one of the hive ships, a precise shot triggered the detonation of hydrogen plasma in its tanks. The explosion exceeded all expectations, obliterating not only the Titanic hive ship, but also hundreds of smaller vessels nearby. The system's defenders cheered at the devastating blow. However, the celebration was short-lived. On the bridge of the Woe to the Vanquished, Uriel Ventris and Admiral Laszlo Tiberius witnessed the horrifying sight of Cordelia being bombarded with viral weapons. By the time they comprehended the situation, it was too late. The deadly virus, annihilating all organic life, had already taken its toll. The planet had been struck by the Mortifactor ship, which Kryptman was aboard at the time. It became evident that the Inquisitor was unwilling to heed the opinions of his adversaries. Despite the successful execution of the plan, he chose to act according to his own methods. This sparked an escalating conflict that nearly resulted in a confrontation between Captain Ventris and Chaplain Astador. The tension reached a boiling point, with everyone in the Astartes hall reaching for their weapons. They were only halted by Admiral Tiberius, who intervened just in time.
We are all servants of the Divine Emperor and must behave accordingly. We must not be like wild beasts or pagans who deny the morals of society. There is no room for personal emotions in our circle.
After these words of the Admiral, respected by all, the tension subsided and the conflict was postponed until better times. Only after that the gathered could start the council, which decided the further strategy of the Imperial forces. However, the defenders had few options. It was unanimously decided to retreat to the line of defense of the world of Tarsis Ultra itself. After a very short period of time, the wave of the Hive fleet reached the main planet that gave its name to the entire system. The Imperium fleet was ready for their arrival and only waited for a convenient opportunity to strike another powerful blow. For this purpose, the last of the available plant from the planet Yulan had already been prepared by the defenders. As soon as the Tyrannids approached at the proper distance, the improvised bomb was launched in their direction. This time, however, the hive mind was ready for a clever ploy by the defenders. With the help of specially designed creatures, he changed the direction of the station, sending it into the thick of the Imperial ship's formation. In order to prevent the defenders from blowing up the plant early, the hive mind created an improvised shield of Tyrannids and spores in front of the intercepted bomb. The veil of this bioshield was so dense that even the full power of the assembled fleet could not penetrate it. Everyone realized the danger of the station exploding in the midst of the ships, so the formation began to fall apart quickly. Everyone tried to be as far away from the epicenter of the explosion as possible. Only one sluggish battleship, Argus, under the command of Admiral Decourt, could not dodge the station, and in a matter of seconds was engulfed by the flames, the brightness of which outshone the sun. The explosion also destroyed several smaller ships that had not managed to escape the affected area. All the other ships were damaged in one way or another. It was a total defeat. With the death of Admiral Decourt, Admiral Tiberius took command of the combined fleet, and his first order was to withdraw from the system. He realized that further combat at this point would only result in the loss of the rest of the fleet and would not stop the Tyrannids. Now the garrison of Tarsis Ultra had only itself to rely on. And it could not be said that this calculation was fundamentally flawed. The world was preparing to meet the enemy under the careful guidance of Ultramarines Sergeant Liakos. Astartes took responsibility not only for organizing the training of the planetary defense forces, but also for strengthening the defensive systems of the planet's main city called Erebus. He, as a true son of Guilliman, was involved in absolutely all issues on which the defense of the planet's capital depended, starting from the uniforms and supplies of soldiers and ending with the demolition of buildings and fortifications that interfered with the defense of the city. He was actively assisted by Astro Militarum officers, Colonel Rabalak, the commander of the Logres Corps, and the commander of one of Craig's Death Corps units, Colonel Stagler. Also helping as much as they could were local official Oberfabricator Montant and the commander of the Planetary Defense Forces, Major Satria. They all worked tirelessly, and by the time the defense of Tarsis Ultra began, it was safe to say that the time the fleet had gained in the desperate rearguard battles had not been wasted. Everything was ready to meet the furious Eater. The sunrise over Erebus that day promised to be an unusual one. Everyone waited in great suspense for the Tyrannids to begin landing on the surface. Thousands of eyes of ordinary humans and space marines were gazing into the scarlet blue sky, waiting to see the torrent of spores raining down from it. Everyone waiting was prepared for the arrival of the enemy, thanks to Inquisitor Kryptman. He had, since his arrival on the planet, ensured that the Marines had learned from the Inquisitor's centuries of research and battles with Tyrannids. This time, the hive mind decided to launch its attack by raiding the city of clouds of harpies. Thousands of flying creatures swooped down on the defenders of Erebus who were on the front lines. Wave after wave, with no regard for casualties, the flying creatures attacked the humans. They searched for weaknesses, literally probing the defenses. People in turn heroically fought back, inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. After a while, the Tyrannids' attack faltered, and they retreated. Although the defense was difficult, Captain Ventris realized that to retreat after the first attack would be a huge mistake. After all, it would severely affect the morale of the Marines. Therefore, even realizing that the second attack would be extremely difficult to repel, Ultramarine decided not to abandon their forward positions. Less than an hour after the first attack, the horizon seemed to move. A wave of chitinous shells crashed into the defenders' defenses. The monsters swarmed the entire valley from edge to edge. The gaps in their throngs that appeared after the Imperial artillery and airstrikes were filled with such speed that it would seem as if the defenders' blows were not damaging them at all. A fierce melee ensued in the positions, threatening to end in the total annihilation of the Imperial forces. This would have been the case if not for a desperate sortie by the Astartes. In it, they were able to reach the swarm leader and destroy him. After that, most of the smaller forms lost control of the hive mind and succumbed to their animal instincts. The Imperium forces took advantage of this and began the slaughter. Those who were not killed by the humans were wiped out by the frost, brought by the coming night. Continued defense in these positions was out of the question. Therefore, the command gave the order to retreat to the second line of defense. But even there, the Emperor's soldiers were not destined to stay long. The military council decided that these positions in the current situation were not favorable enough. Therefore, without waiting for the Tyrannids to attack again, the Marines received permission to withdraw outside the walls of the city. Unfortunately, the organized retreat ended in tragedy. The Tyrannids outplayed Erebus's headquarters and attacked the retreating human forces that were on the march at the time. The first strike came from the direction that was considered the least likely of all. The situation threatened to turn into a catastrophe, so Colonel Rabalak decided to save the situation. He realized that the main blame for the miscalculation lay on him, so he decided to change the course of events by sacrificing himself. He moved his command post, which was a giant-sized, heavily armored vehicle, in the direction of the enemy. Thus, the colonel drew the Tyrannids' attention to himself, which gave the trapped units a chance to start retreating behind the walls of the city. The colonel and his entire staff fell victim to the enemy. For the next 4 days, The hive mind persisted in sending wave after wave of its spawn into the attack, but all waves crashed against the sturdy walls of Erebus, beneath which already lay mountains of bodies. If the defenders of the city did not burn out the remains of the monsters with flamethrowers, their living brethren would soon be able to climb the walls unhindered by the mountains of corpses. Soldiers standing on the walls were pelted with bioshells, capable of shattering masonry, spores with poisonous gases, claiming hundreds of lives. The apothecaries of Erebus were already overcrowded and simply could not cope with the flow of wounded. The consequence of this was the decision to abandon the first line of walls and withdraw to the second line. On top of that, the situation was complicated by the fact that small groups of Tyrannids began to infiltrate the city more and more often. Some of them were sneaking through sewer systems, some through abandoned caves, and some were coming down from mountains previously considered impregnable. All of this only fueled panic among the local population, but the command couldn't get a single squad off the ground to get busy mopping up the streets of Erebus. All this led to an increase in civilian casualties. The situation in the city began to heat up, aggravating the already difficult situation due to the continuing attacks of the Tyrannids. The spectre of Barbaros's fate began to loom before the command, but suddenly Inquisitor Kryptman gave reason for hope. Shortly before, the forces of the Death Guard Astartes and the Ultramarines had captured a lictor who had infiltrated the city before the siege began. With this loot, they were able to create a drug that made the already well-mutated Tyrannid cells mutate even more. This weapon could help destroy the entire hive fleet at once, but to do so they needed to deliver the drug directly into the heart of one of the motherships and inject it into the Queen of the Swarm. It was not an easy task at all. Not only was it necessary to get inside the Tyrannid's bioship, the structure of which the Imperium had a very vague idea, but before that it was necessary to get to it, breaking through the powerful defenses of the Hive fleet, but there was no other way, so it was decided to try. A detachment from the Death Guard, led by Captain Ventress, was assembled to carry out the operation. The remnants of the fleet that had arrived back in the system after regrouping were called in to help. The moment had come for the final attack. For the fleet, if unsuccessful, this attack would surely be the last, because its forces were only strong enough to simply break through to the mothership and break through the corridor for the Astartes Thunderhawk. But they certainly wouldn't be able to destroy the ship on their own. Losing the few remaining ships, Admiral Tiberius had great difficulty breaking through the ranks of enemy bioships, but in the end he succeeded. A small ship slipped through the gap, bringing death to an entire tentacle of the Leviathan fleet. A few minutes later, the Astartes began to advance deep into the ship, encountering many of the horrible creatures spawned by the bioship. At the same time, as if suspecting something, the Tyrannid's army launched a general offensive, seemingly realizing that this was likely to be their last attempt. So the squad's mission turned into a race against time. Now the lives of all the citizens of Erebus depended on the actions of the Astartes. They had no margin for error. Astartes honorably fulfilled their mission despite all the obstacles appearing on the way. This caused the entire Hive fleet to very quickly begin to agonizingly perish, dying of rampant multiple mutations. Tarsis Ultra was saved. While this battle was not inferior to the battles for Macragge and Ekarth for Forth, it was only a prologue. The human Imperium had yet to face the full might of the Leviathan Hive. Only one tentacle had been destroyed on Tarsis Ultra, which meant that another Eater strike was imminent. This time, Kryptman offered not to act as a passive defender, to force the Tyrannids to act according to his rules and stop their advance deep into the galaxy at any cost. And this time, the price was the lives of billions of people. The Inquisitor decided to use a scorched earth tactic long known to mankind. Now, hundreds of planets in the Tarsis Ultra system had to share the fate of Cordelia. Having determined the routes of Leviathan's main tentacles, Kryptman began to create a kind of cordon of galactic proportions. On his orders, he would evacuate the population of the planets he had identified. The planet would then be subjected to exterminatus. When the Tyrannids approached it, they found no trace of biomass. The plan looked great on paper, but because of the terrible imperial bureaucracy, causing a lot of delays and lack of proper organization, very often the population of planets could not be evacuated completely. And sometimes the evacuation couldn't even begin in time for the fleet to arrive with the order to destroy the planet. In such situations, Cryptman put cold calculation over emotion and destroyed the planet along with its inhabitants. Of course, in the end, such drastic measures paid off. The advance of the huge fleet, which found itself without biomass, was stopped. But Cryptman's actions led to a terrible genocide, unseen since the heresy of Horus. Such actions of the Inquisitor could not go unnoticed, and very soon his own colleagues branded Cryptman a traitor, a fool, and a radical. He was declared Carta Exheredatus, thus stripped of his position, all power and official authorization to act on behalf of the Imperium government. Opinion of the fallacy of Cryptman's actions became especially vocal after several devastated Imperial worlds were overrun by orcs from the actively expanding Octarius Empire. But the Inquisitor was not foolish enough to simply try to buy time to prepare for war by the Solar and Tempestus fleets at the cost of billions of lives of the Emperor's subjects. His plan was far more cunning and complex. The former Inquisitor decided to put the might of a most dangerous enemy at the service of the Imperium. He planned to redirect one of Leviathan's tentacles in the direction of the Orc Empire, Octarius, already occupying almost an entire sector of the galaxy. The Imperial forces had already spent vast resources on the war with the Orcs for years, which had only consumed countless reinforcements without bringing the coveted victory in return. In Cryptman's opinion, his plan could solve this problem. With the help of the Death Guard's Space Marines, who remained loyal to their patron, Cryptman captured a brood of Genestealers alive and loaded them onto the flame of eternal torment, a space wanderer that emerged from warp ahead of Leviathan's advance. Its route was then altered in the direction of the Orc Empire. Next, exactly as Cryptman had expected, Hivemind altered the tentacle's movement to follow the wanderer. The plan worked, and the rogue Inquisitor managed to collide two formidable enemies of humans. This maneuver would later be known as the Cryptman Gambit. At first it seemed that this plan had no flaws. But Fidus did not take into account one fact. Both of these races live only for war. That's why this conflict became a real celebration for them. Orcs began flying to the battlefield from territories light years away just to fight a new and powerful opponent, which dramatically increased the ranks of the Orc army, albeit now shifted to the theatre of war with the Tyrannids. For the Tyrannids, on the other hand, this company was a veritable feast of biomass, which the endless streams of orcs represented. So it soon began to dawn on many that Cryptman had only delayed the inevitable. Whoever emerged from this conflict victorious would be many times stronger. In addition, it was only part of the Hive fleet that had invaded the galaxy. Leviathan, with its other tentacle, continued to push deeper into the Imperium, including the solar system. This led to a number of smaller, but also significant battles. The first of these was the battle for the Griffon IV custodial world. This was one of the most important treasure worlds for the entire Imperium. It was the home of the Astra Militarum Lemon Russ Conqueror type main tank. It was also home to the Legion of Titans Legio Griffonicus. Realizing the importance of this planet, the Mechanicum even decided to sacrifice their world, Tesla Prime, evacuating all forces from there and giving it to the Tyrannids without a fight. The tech priests were actively preparing to defend their precious world. As soon as the enemy's advance units landed on the planet, an epic battle ensued. Initially, the preponderance was on the side of the Mechanicum, supported by the firepower of the Imperial Titans. However, it wasn't long before the Hive fleet adapted to the new enemy, pitting the Bio-Titan against the defenders of the world. Despite the heroism and fortitude of the Imperial warriors, the advance of the Tyrannids continued. One by one, the Titans of Legio Griffonicus died, torn apart by a dozen claws. Despite the staggering casualty ratio, the invaders could not be stopped, which led to a natural outcome a few days later. The defeat at Griffon 4 marked the loss of a crucial manufacturing world and an entire legion of Titans. It hit the Imperium's defences hard. This was also followed by the battles for the Cardinal World of Shadow's Edge and the Agri World of Gorgo, also ending in defeat for the Imperium. But not always the humans were unsuccessful in the fight against the Tyrannids. For example, on the Death World of Yorn V, the Catechan regiments of Astra Militarum managed to hold off the enemy's advance until reinforcements arrived, delaying the battle for the planet and causing significant damage to the Hive fleet. But the battle that would mark the end of the Third Titanic War had yet to happen. The Hive fleet began its advance toward the home of the Blood Angels, Val. It was not originally thought that a desert world with virtually no biomass on its surface would be of interest to a food-hungry enemy, but for a reason known only to the Hive swarm, it still decided to head for its home planet of Sanguinius. The descendants of the Ninth Legion were in real danger of perishing. Therefore, Master Dante of the Blood Angels took a number of necessary measures. The first of them was the decision to gather all the air orders, sending them a call for help. The second, much more severe, was the order to destroy all worlds in the path of the Tyrannids before they arrived. This was to weaken the Leviathan Hive fleet. By a conservative estimate, at least 30 worlds were subjected to exterminatus, so the cluster of stars known as the Red Scar slowly began to turn into a desolate wasteland, not only by the Tyrannids, but by the humans themselves. Everyone from the reserved warriors of the Carmine Blades to the uncouth dismemberers and blood knights responded to Dante's cry. Under other circumstances, other Sanguinius descendants would have refused to even be on the same planet as their brothers, whom everyone openly regarded as renegades. But under the circumstances, every warrior counted. Thus, the Master of the Blood Angels managed to gather under his command about 30,000 warriors, descendants of the Ninth Legion. Although this army was comparable to the former power of the Legion of Blood Angels, both Dante and his commanders realized that their chances of victory were slim, but there was nowhere to go for help. Parallel to the Leviathan's attack on Baal, the events of the fall of Cadia were unfolding. Therefore, all the forces and attention of the Imperium were drawn to this theatres of war. But no one was willing to surrender without a fight and leave such an important sanctuary for the Imperium to the Xenos unperturbed. Therefore, both day and night preparations for battle were underway on Baal. The planet and its moons were prepared to greet the voracious guests with volleys of bolters, laser beams, and plasma charges. Additionally, the Blood Angels chapter master issued an order to gather all the population of the planet, aged 10 and above, capable of bearing arms. It was decided to hastily create a semblance of a planetary defense force from them. These were the only units that the descendants of Sanguinius could rely on for assistance. The last issue to resolve was who would lead this vast army. To address this, a council was convened, inviting the masters and distinguished captains of the called chapters. To avoid unnecessary disputes, Dante took the floor first and put forward his candidacy. The chapter masters were offered a vote, according to which they had to either support the candidacy of the millennia-old Astartes and place themselves under his command, or reject it and go their separate ways if they deemed it necessary. However, the voting results showed almost unanimous agreement among the chapter representatives on this issue. Only a few expressed opposition, not because they were dissatisfied with Dante's candidacy, but only because it was a direct violation of the Codex Astartes. However, they ultimately agreed with the majority opinion, also staying to defend their native planet of Sanguinius. Time inexorably marched forward, and the shadow in the warp was steadily approaching Baal. Its approach meant the imminent arrival of the enemy into the system, and the Tyrannids didn't keep themselves waiting long. An endless stream of hive fleets began to appear before the vanguard of the defenders of Baal. This vanguard was represented by a combined fleet assembled from all the ships available to the defending orders of Baal. In the space before the planet, a space battle erupted. The formidable armada, with its overwhelming firepower, boldly struck into the disordered ranks of the Hive fleets and began to pass through them like a hot knife through butter. Spewing a barrage of fire, Imperial vessels tore the living Tyranid ships to shreds. However, despite the superior firepower, the Angels' fleet hopelessly outnumbered by the enemy. Dozens, if not hundreds, of large Xenos ships outnumbered a single Imperial vessel. Gnawing their losses, the Hive fleets did not relent in their pressure on the defenders of Baal and did not even consider retreating. At this moment, the defenders came to realize that they would soon run out of ammunition before the endless stream of enemies dwindled. Therefore, their only option was to heroically perish, selling their lives as dearly as possible. And so it happened soon after. With all their mass, the Tyrannids managed to scatter the formation of the Imperial fleet into small groups, sending swarms of small ships to the surrounded vessels and literally peppering them with torpedoes. They disabled the Imperium's technology one by one. The end was predictable. Within a few hours, the main forces of the defenders of Baal's fleet were dispersed. But even as the last flashes of the doomed planet's space battle faded from the sky, spores rained down from above. The sky literally darkened with them. Planetary defense systems worked tirelessly, but they were unable to destroy all the targets approaching the planet. The invasion of Baal had begun. The first wave of Tyrannids was completely destroyed by accurate salvos from calibrated guns and the storm of bolter fire, never reaching the frontline defenses of the planet's defenders. But the initial success was deceptive. The surface of the planet and its moons began to be literally covered by a living carpet of Hive fleet spawn. Despite the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Tyrannids, Dante's measures to fortify defensive positions began to bear fruit. One of the most successful decisions was the idea to dig a gigantic trench and fill it with thirst water. This liquid extracted moisture from all living things it came into contact with. The unique properties of this substance made it perfect for combating the endless stream of organic creatures. It was in this water that the first mass attacks by the Tyrannids on the defenders' frontline positions were drowned. Unfortunately, winning this battle with just one clever trap was impossible. Soon enough, the hive mind found a way to overcome the trench by sacrificing tens of thousands of lesser forms which piled up a crossing with their bodies. Without wasting a moment, under the Imperial artillery's torrential fire, hordes of monsters surged towards the Baal defenders' positions. The Astartes officers understood that ordinary mortals wouldn't stand a chance in close combat against the moving wave of claws and teeth. Therefore, realizing the futility of keeping regular soldiers at the front line at that moment, the Astartes ordered the militia units to retreat. To ensure that the organized withdrawal didn't turn into a panicked flight, it was decided to cover this maneuver with the fire of the available Blood Angels war machines. Thus, sacrificing the machinery, they managed to save a large number of people who would later have a significant impact on the course of the battle. And they were saved because they managed to reach the second line of defense, which was protected by powerful void shields. These ancient defense systems successfully held back the onslaught of the approaching hordes of Tyrannids. For a moment, Dante even thought that the outcome of the battle might turn in their favor. But everything abruptly changed due to the unexpected fall of the shields. A lictor infiltrated the Blood Angels' fortress monastery, called Arx Angelicum. Guided by the hive mind, it managed to penetrate the room housing the shield generator and destroyed it. This instantly collapsed the energy system of the entire defense, and the second line of defense fell. The troops began to retreat towards the walls of the fortress monastery. Simultaneously with these events, the battle for the planet's moons, Baal Prime and Baal Secundus, was raging. Dante deliberately deployed part of his forces on the moons to force the enemy to attack on 3 fronts simultaneously. The Flesh Tearers and Blood Knights defended Baal Prime, while Dante entrusted the defense of Baal Secundus to the Carmine Blades. On this moon, the astropathic choirs were located, desperately trying to break through the shadow in the warp and transmit a message requesting assistance. If the defense on Baal Secundus managed to contain the advancing enemy with varying degrees of success, the situation on Baal Prime was much worse. The advancing waves of Tyrannids slowly but surely pushed the Astartes from their positions. Realizing that further resistance in the current situation was futile, the Flesh Tearers chapter, Master Gabriel Seth and his counterpart from the Blood Knights, Centaur Jewel, decided to break through to the landing pad. In the prevailing situation, both Seth and Jewel understood that they would be much more useful if they joined their brothers on Baal. Therefore, it was decided that the remnants of the two chapters would force a breakthrough together. At the same time, on the planet itself, the Defenders' forces retreated to the last line of defense located behind the walls of the Arx Angelicum fortress. The entire course of events since the fall of the Void Shields indicated to Dante that the battle was lost and the remnants of his army were doomed. Such a fate would have befallen the sons of Sanguinius if the situation on the battlefield had not been changed by the events that occurred hundreds of thousands of light years away from Baal. The fall of Cardia led to the appearance of the Great Rift, dividing the galaxy into two parts. This event caused disturbances in the warp comparable in power to those that plunged the human race into the Age of Strife more than 10,000 years ago. All those engaged in battle felt the fierce ethereal storms engulfing the warp. But it affected the Tyranids most of all. The warp energies literally tore apart the collective hive mind, disrupting the connection between individual organisms. In an instant, this turned the formidable army into a pack of wild beasts, beginning to devour each other. Perhaps that's why the appearance of the Great Rift provoked the most ambiguous reaction among the defenders of Baal. On the one hand, everyone understood that the breakthrough of warp energy into the real world was the consequence of some incredible tragedy that had occurred in another part of the Imperium. On the other hand, it gave them a life-saving respite, greatly weakening the enemy. This was not the only blow to the Tyranids. On Baal Prime, a new enemy appeared among the invaders, and it came as a complete surprise to both the hive mind and the Emperor's warriors. Due to the reality rift on the moon's surface, the ancient enemy of all Blood Angel's descendants emerged, Kabanda. Appearing literally amidst the throng of rampaging monsters, the demon summoned his army from the warp and indulged in his favorite pastime: unrestrained slaughter. The battle with this hitherto unseen enemy so captivated him that he seemed to forget about his longtime foes, the Blood Angels. Only an attempt by the Blood Knight's Master Jewel momentarily distracted him from the battle that had gripped him. Quickly dispatching the nuisance Astartes, he once again immersed himself in the fight against the Tyranids. Kabanda and his warriors continued the slaughter until the last Tyranid fell on the devastated moon. After that, the demon and his army disappeared, leaving behind a huge mark of corn made from the skulls of the defeated Xenos. The respite obtained by the Imperial forces lasted for 5 days, during which the hive mind attempted to regain control over its scattered forces. It succeeded only on the 6th day. Slowly but surely, the Tyranids began to intensify their pressure on the last line of defense. Realizing that sooner or later all this would end in a breakthrough of their positions, Dante decided on a desperate move. He ordered to prepare for the final attack. It was the only chance for the Astartes to either change the course of the battle or at least die heroically, covering themselves with undying glory. When all preparations for the attack were complete, the remnants of a vast army formed before Dante. All Astartes painted their armor black, presenting a massive death company assembled to hear the parting words of the great warrior Dante before heading to certain death. After a short prayer, the Blood Angel's master took the floor. "There is always beauty, even in the deepest ugliness, even in defeat," Dante uttered. "Your song elevates us all above this earthly reality, for we are all equally angels and warriors. Our dedication to the Emperor and our genetic father is the model that citizens of the Imperium have long aspired to. And now, we stand on the brink of annihilation, and this cannot be changed. And I tell you, we will not become a footnote in the archives, but a legend of the Imperium. If the Tyranids had remained unchecked, we would have had a chance to survive by hiding behind the walls of the Eternity Gate. But they are regrouping. The hive mind has recovered. Our librarians report a shadow that has fallen once again upon our worlds. It is weak, but it grows stronger with each passing minute, coalescing around one powerful nexus. If this continues, the Tyranids will once again become a unified mind. And then they will begin to attack without mercy, and we will all perish. There is no word from the fleet. The cosmos is filled with warp energies. If we strike at their leader, perhaps we can defeat the swarm with one deadly blow and save the worlds beyond Baal. We have blades, we have will, so let us crush the skulls of these beasts. Are we not the sons of the great angel? Are we not the most blessed of all Adeptus Astartes? Our Primarch fell among the first, but he lives eternally within all of us. The flesh and blood of our bodies are vessels for his soul. For 10,000 years, we have defended his legacy in the fortress of our bodies. Stop looking to the future and think about what we can do in the coming hours of glory. And if it is our fate to sink into the darkness of extinction, let us do so with swords in hand and the rage of Sanguinius in our hearts. And when stories of us reach other worlds, people will rise and say, "We will not fall, we will not die silently, and through battle we will honor the valor of the sons of Baal." Inspired by their leader, the sons of Sanguinius, full of determination, gathered near the gates, ready to charge into battle. But first, according to Dante's plan, the cursed prisoners of the Tower of Amareo rushed into the attack. At such a moment, the master could not deny his fallen brothers the opportunity to die gloriously in battle, rather than slowly continuing to lose their minds locked in the tower. Sending the Blood Angels into battle, Dante ordered the gates to be opened. Following the Berserk Space Marines, the inheritors of the traditions of the glorious Ninth Legion charged into battle. Before each of them stood only one goal: to reach the Hive Tyrant, which served as the link from which the chains of the Tyranids' command structure began to rebuild. They had to kill him at all costs to finally disorganize the Xenos. Enveloped in the red thirst, some in the black rage, the Space Marines plunged into the ranks of the bloodthirsty monsters, crushing their chitinous armor and spilling rivers of blood. More ferociously than anyone else, Dante tore through the crowds of monsters. He was the first to reach the Hive Tyrant. An unequal battle unfolded between them. The opponents matched each other in agility and skill, but the advantage in strength remained on the side of the monster. Only thanks to Dante's indomitable willpower and selflessness could he deal a mortal blow to his opponent, albeit at the cost of sustaining heavy injuries. Although the Tyranids had completely lost centralized control, even in their disarray, they posed a significant threat. Only the God Emperor knows if the remaining forces of the Blood Angels would have been enough to cleanse the planet of Xenos. But Baal was aided by Robuta Guilliman, conducting his Indomitus crusade. From that moment on, a new chapter in the lives of the descendants of the great angel was turned, and the Third Tyrannid War came to an end. It is extremely difficult to name the victor in the conflict between the Tyranids and humanity. On one hand, humanity managed to halt the advance of Hive Fleet Leviathan on all fronts. On the other hand, it came at an inestimable cost to humanity. Moreover, the current conflict did not end with the destruction of the Hive fleets as in previous wars. Therefore, the next attack of the Great Devourer remained only a matter of time. Another problem was the direction from which the enemy would launch their next assault, and this time it was completely unexpected. The enemy began their onslaught in the Segmentum Pacificus, where they were least expected. The attack, as usual, began in silence. Space probes that had been transmitting information for centuries suddenly ceased to function. Subsequently, beacon after beacon went dark in the Asmodeox and Morpheum sectors. Initially, these suspicious coincidences were attributed to technical malfunctions. Moreover, no distress signals were received from those regions of the galaxy. Without any incentive to investigate, the local imperial bureaucracy remained inactive, believing there was no danger, especially since those regions had other problems that were of much greater interest to imperial officials. By that time, the Asmodeox sector was struggling against an Orc-Wah. That was gaining momentum. In the Morpheum sector, a warp storm known as Gogmagog had erupted. All of this allowed the Tyranids to expand their sphere of influence unnoticed. Reports of the unexpected appearance of Tyranids in the Segmentum Pacificus came simultaneously from two places. The first to report the invasion was the supreme astropath of the Morpheum sector, whose visions showed the looming threat. The next report came from the Bastion subsector, which had long been repelling Orc attacks. Suddenly, the Orcs ceased their raids and command rejoiced at the apparent calm. But the joy was short-lived. Tyrannids quickly replaced the Orcs. From indirect signs and the roots of advancement, it was determined that the Emperor's warriors were dealing with two tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan. They were so vast that Imperial Command bestowed separate names upon them. One in the Asmodeox sector was named Nautilon. The other in the Morpheum sector was designated Promethor in Imperial documents. It became increasingly evident that if the ruthless invaders were not stopped from advancing, they would soon reach the Segmentum Solar. Moreover, the two tendrils had enough strength between them to break through to Holy Terror. Understanding this, many worlds began fortifying their defenses, but none could withstand the onslaught of the Great Devourer. Soon the news of what was happening reached Terra. The first to react to these alarming signals was the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, Trajan Valoris. He began hastily assembling forces for defense to meet the enemy on the distant approaches to Terra. Under his command came many regiments, both existing ones and newly formed ones, exclusively for defense against the advancing Hive fleets. In addition to him, defensive forces were formed by other factions. Units of the Adeptus Astartes, Adeptus Sororitas, Imperial Knights, and even the Adeptus Mechanicus joined together in a unit called the Solar Blades. These units were given greater freedom of action and, even in the absence of reliable information, began to deliver successful strikes against the advancing enemy deep into the galaxy. The calculation was based on their speed and guerrilla tactics, which was supposed to bleed the enemy and force them to turn away from their intended target. But even then, Lord Solar Leontus decided not to rely solely on the Solar Blades and sat down with his advisors to calculate possible breakthrough paths. After their determination, active preparations for the defense of worlds located on these routes began. Despite the initially successful actions of the Solar Blades, shortcomings in Imperial tactics quickly began to emerge. The human command, as often happened before, prepared for the previous war with the Tyrannids, relying on the experience of their actions in the previous 3 Tyrannid wars. But the hive mind once again changed tactics. Now it did not strive to reach the goal as quickly as possible, sometimes even skipping some worlds. Now its tendrils moved like an avalanche, leaving behind completely cleared space devoid of biomass. This, of course, slowed them down, but also increased the numerical strength of the Great Devourer's forces. Nevertheless, thanks to the sluggishness of the tendrils, the intervention of other races, and the heroic battles of the Solar Blades, the continuation of the tendrils' movement was halted, and the swarms began to disintegrate into smaller parts. Many began to feel that the advance of the Great Devourer had been stopped. But hope in the Imperium of the 43rd millennium is a double-edged sword, which can wound both its victim and its wielder. The joy of success was quickly overshadowed by reports of the appearance of another tendril in the Segmentum Pacificus, which had already engulfed many clusters and outposts of the leagues of Votan. This helped it to gain great power. The news of the new enemy was first reported by the combat group Faustus from the Sextus fleet. They were conducting an investigation into the disappearance of their combat units and stumbled upon a new concentration of Tyrannids. Another tendril began to rise from the depths of the galaxy, and its first strike was against the Bastion subsector, which suddenly became the target of Tyrannids preparing to attack the very heart of the Imperium. With time, the situation only worsened. Despite all efforts to stop the enemy, the Imperial forces were unsuccessful. The conquerors continued to seize world after world, and unrest began to rise within the Imperium. Rebellions became increasingly widespread in various regions. Some officials of the Imperium even suspected that Genestealer cults were behind this. More and more frequently, Imperial commanders encountered disobedience among their subordinates. Only the fact that such cases were compensated by mass heroism and self-sacrifice did not make the situation completely hopeless. In addition to this, other races actively joined the battles against the tendrils, through whose territories the tendrils' path lay. But still, its advance continued inexorably. Fleets were especially active, in which humans discovered ships of a new class. They contained some pulsating brain nodes that induced terrifying hallucinations in those nearby. In addition to this, these vessels carried hordes of invaders, mainly consisting of psychic beings. This made this hive fleet much stronger and made it much easier to overcome the defenses of Imperial forces. System by system, the enemy approached Sanctum. The success of the defense of this world directly determined the further course of the campaign in the solar segmentum. Therefore, active preparations were made for its defense. Additional forces were concentrated in the system, new defensive structures were built, and old ones were reinforced. And the first to meet the Tyranids were the Wall of Dawn. It consisted of a belt of asteroids, on the largest of which the Mechanicus equipped several fortresses, which met the incoming enemy with fierce fire. Despite the huge losses inflicted by the defenders of the wall, the Tyrannids still overwhelmed them in numbers, and ultimately, one by one, tore apart the asteroids on which the fortresses were located. Then it was the turn of the main planet of the system. Hive fleets attacked Sanctum from all sides. However, here, the Great Devourer was in for a surprise. The Imperial command prepared an ambush that was supposed to deliver a powerful blow and turn the tide of battle. From two directions, two large Imperial fleets began to advance on the ships of the Great Devourer, which had dispersed around the planet for landing. Moreover, among the ranks of one of them, a formidable phalanx was moving. The tasks before the Imperial forces were extremely clear: to prevent the enemy from landing on the planet and to destroy the larger ships, thereby killing the hive mind. As a result of a heavy space battle in fulfilling the second task, the Imperial forces achieved much greater success, destroying many large hive fleets. But unfortunately, these actions did not help prevent the landing on Sanctum, and the forces of the swarm still retained control. Therefore, millions of organisms were able to land on the planet and begin the invasion, even despite the fact that the Imperial fleet, aviation and artillery relentlessly inflicted merciless strikes on the landing zones. The battle transitioned into a phase of ground warfare. Combat actions on the planet took on a chaotic nature. This time, Imperial forces deviated from the tactic of passive defense and began to attack the Tyrannids themselves, launching counter-offensives with numerous armored strikes supported by the Adeptus Astartes, Adeptus Sororitas, Mechanicus, and the Astra Militarum. Such tactics bore fruit. It prevented the Hive warriors from completely overrunning the planet, as had happened in the past, giving the defenders much more room for maneuver. However, the presence of impassable areas on the planet allowed the hive mind to create several hubs of concentration for its forces. Eventually, the critical mass of Tyrannids accumulated in these areas burst forth and gradually began to push back the Imperial forces into their fortresses. The most powerful of these fortresses was a monastery called Rhizoid. Lord Solar Leontus and the Magister of the Order of the White Templars, Cruxor Stavro, were stationed there commanding the defense of the world. And it was their destruction that became the goal of the Hive's attack. Hundreds of Trigons and Morlocks took part in the assault, and, in addition, a Hive tyrant was spotted among the attackers. Despite innumerable losses suffered by the army of monsters, they managed to breach the first line of defense. Moreover, the defenders suffered heavy damage from 3 emissaries of the Norn, who stealthily infiltrated the city and struck critical points of the monastery fortress. One of their targets was Lord Solar Leontus, who would have fallen to the claws of one of the emissaries if not for the timely arrival of the defenders of the Golden Throne. This would have dealt an irreparable blow to both the morale of the defenders and the defense as a whole, not only of Sanctum but also of the entire Segmentum Solar. Adeptus Custodes brought Trajan Valoris to the planet along with part of the Solar Blade's forces. This difficult decision was made to prevent the fall of Sanctum. However, it was necessary to weaken the front holding back the fleets of Nautilon and Promothor. If the Hive mind realizes this, a breakthrough in the defense in this sector can be expected soon, which would be a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. After all, there are currently no forces capable of stopping the Tyrannids' advance towards the Imperium, and this means that the road to Terra will then be open. On the galactic west and east, the Leviathan fleet was halted. This cost humanity immense sacrifices and an unimaginable amount of resources. However, until none of the tendrils are destroyed, it cannot be said that there is a complete victory over the Leviathan fleet, especially considering that it is still unknown how many forces the Great Devourer has left. Especially given that thanks to its successful progress in both the Third and Fourth Tyrannical Wars, Leviathan managed to consume dozens, if not hundreds of planets, the biomass of which went into breeding new warriors. The number of individuals capable of using psychic powers began to grow frighteningly fast, which undoubtedly will affect the balance of power in the future. All of this does not inspire hope for a favorable outcome. Therefore, humanity can only hope that the Mechanicus on their Forge worlds will be able to produce more bolt rounds than Leviathan can generate new monsters during this time.